Hi, everybody. Today I want to talk about the ivory tower expert, the kind that one finds all over academia, and particularly those who shape and inform public school policy. Now, if you've ever met an academic expert, and you'll know if you do, they usually leave you with a distinct impression. But what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how the ivory tower expert was first created, how they function within academia, and how they operate to influence public school policy. And by doing that, I hope to later show that many times their expert opinions are actually motivated by forces that lie outside your best interests, and more importantly, outside your child's best interest. Again, let me begin my discussion here by taking you back to my own doctoral studies, and particularly the time when I was studying for my oral exams. Now, you may ask, what are oral exams? And that's a good question. It's part of a PhD program, and it's that very portion where you're required to read a large body of literature and critical theory, and then you're later tested on it. And that's usually a 2-hour-long oral examination, and you answer all these difficult questions that a panel of professors are throwing at you. And it's very hectic, as you might imagine. And every doctoral student always gets all nervous about this, but you usually have a year or 2 years to prepare for this test. So in that year or 2 years, you're reading day and night, and I mean constantly. And for me, that meant reading across 2 centuries of literature, which was the 19th century and the 20th century. I actually took it a step further than this, and that is, while reading, I started to compile a database which in the end included about 350 authors. So as you might imagine, as I read through that entire year, that database kept growing larger and larger in size. More than that, it became necessary to, after a while, catalog each one of those authors into their respective literary periods. So I had authors in the Revolutionary period, in the American Renaissance, in the Realist period, in the Modernist period, the Postmodernist period, and finally the Contemporary period. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Well, because something amazing happened along the way, and this is what it was. After a while, I was able to see across entire centuries of our nation's development, and I began to see patterns emerge. And some of the most interesting patterns were in the authors themselves, how they were raised, what kind of families they came from, were they born poor or were they born into money, what kind of education did they have, or what were the issues that they most passionately believed in, or what kind of tragedies befell them. For instance, in the Revolutionary or the American Renaissance or Realist period, a lot of authors suffered immeasurable pain and tragedy because many had children who died at a young age. I mean, this happened to one author after another after another. It was just the reality of the times. And there were other patterns that started to emerge as well. By far, the most curious and odd pattern that I discovered was within the contemporary literary period itself. And this relates to what I'm about to talk to you about today. It just so happens that in the contemporary period, an overwhelming percentage of these writers and poets were folks who taught at the universities. It's true. Yeah, sure, there were a sprinkling of independent authors here and there, but the large majority occupied university teaching positions. And I found that to be just a little bit weird. And I say a little bit weird because the earlier literary periods of our nation had this incredible variety of authors. I mean, there were freelance writers, working class writers, independent travelers, a lot of international explorers. There was manumitted slaves. There was industrialists, religious sermons. Female writers were in there, whether they were wealthy, homemakers, or spinsters. Those females were in there. You also had soldiers' memoirs. You had political pamphlets, independent newspaper editors, autobiographies for sure, and Native American journals. I mean, you had all kinds of variety. And now, all of a sudden, when we get to the late 20th century and early 21st century, all this variety disappears. And then all the writers almost across the board have one profession. They all teach at the university. Sure, these authors all wrote in different genres, I'll admit that. So there was a variety in their writing, but they all worked in the same kind of place, within the same kind of institutional structure. And that saddened me a little bit, because it represented to me a kind of shrinkage. It was a reduction from all these varied and exciting and even dangerous life stories that I had read earlier throughout our nation's history. And now, it seemed like all these authors were career-minded lecturers who were working in the safe and secure ivory tower. And that made a huge difference in their writing, at least to me, because I could now sense that there was a kind of controlled tameness in their writing. Their stories and their liberal viewpoints as well got very predictable to me. And so this whole contemporary period was a little tiresome. It was a little boring to me. Now, we have to ask ourselves a question right here. What was the crucial element that accounted for this shift in literature in the late 20th and early 21st centuries? And the answer is, to me at least, the university. Because the new authors of the day were now operating under the auspices of the university. It was kind of like a cooperative marriage of sorts, and the university was co-signing and endorsing their authorial power. But there's a reason why this happened, folks. Beginning much earlier, starting in the mid-1950s and onward, the four-year university began to take more and more of a central role in American life, especially for middle-class kids. You have to understand that back in the 1940s, the university was really a place that was reserved for rich kids. It was not anything like the university that we know today. Listen to Nicholas Lehman, the author of The Secret History of Meritocracy, as he writes, quote, "Up to the start of the Second World War, rich young men with servants whose lives revolved around parties and sports, not studying, set the tone of college life. Back then, Harvard students came from the wealthy boys' boarding schools in New England, the kind where parents could register their sons at birth. Pretty much anyone who went to these boarding schools and who could pay the tuition could later get into Harvard or Princeton or Yale. Even the faculties at these high-level universities were made up of proper Bostonians and not the modern academics that you find in universities today," end quote. But that all changed with a guy named James Bryant Conant in the late 1930s, because he was the one who helped engineer what we now know as the SAT test, which he used to allow poor and middle-class families a chance to test into the university system. And the result was the modern university system that we have today, that we know today. James Bryant Conant really took the power away from these rich Eastern Seaboard families and created a university system, one that was really open to anyone who could test into it. And in doing so, he took away the university as a club med for rich kids and made it into a place for serious academic work. But that being said, the university, with all its newfound preeminence, began to take on a life of its own. It began to become a clearinghouse of sorts and, unfortunately, a gatekeeper of ideas. More importantly, the intellectuals within the university itself began to be taken more seriously by the public. They became, after a while, the ivory tower experts that everybody listened to. And that's what we still have today. Ivory tower experts who, because of their high academic training, because of their PhDs, are more or less unquestioned by the general public at large. But what I want to do today is argue against that paradigm. And here's why. Folks, there is an inherent danger that occurs when you place implicit trust in any one group of people, no matter what their qualifications and no matter how intelligent they purport to be. There's just a danger in doing that. When any one group feels that society at large has granted them unmediated trust, the eventual result will almost always be abuse of that power. Now, I've been on this earth for 56 years now, and I've seen this over and over and over again in my lifetime. And it's no different with the university. And it's certainly no different with the ivory tower experts who reside and work within that university system. If you give these folks your unquestioned reverence, your unmediated trust, and you place that trust above your own intuitive common sense, you will be in the wrong. Let me say that again. You will be in the wrong. And I say that because this trust that we give ivory tower experts almost always operates under a certain implicit assumption, and that is that those who are highly educated are also equally principled. Let me say that again. It operates under a certain implicit assumption that those who are highly educated are also equally principled. And I found out the hard way, mind you, that that's just not the case. The intelligentsia, folks, can be just as unscrupulous as the next person, and in some cases much worse. How do I know that? Because I've gone to the highest level of academic training, all the way to the doctorate, and I have seen firsthand the hypocrisy of the intelligentsia. Not in all cases, but enough times to make me think twice. Now, what I want to do is offer you, the general public, a different paradigm. It's a different viewpoint from what you're used to, and I think it's far more useful, it'll be far more practical, and definitely far more effective. And here it is. If you, the regular Joe Blow, have these four things: 1, a decent set of principles and values. 2, a solid set of parental role models. 3, a decent level of everyday smarts. And 4, a decent level of common sense. If you have these four things, then you can be, just with these attributes alone, head and shoulders above any ivory tower expert. Head and shoulders above them. Now, wait a minute, you say. They're highly educated, and I'm not. True. But they're highly educated only in a certain way. And let me explain. Ivory tower experts are almost by design unidimensional. Not always, but a huge percentage are. That is, they have a very narrowly defined life experience. They've gone from cradle to college and then all the way up to the doctorate level. And again, not all of them, but 90% of them at least have never done anything else with their lives. Are they smart? Yes, very much so in fact. Brilliant even. But at the same time, they're a little myopic and very much fixated on their own worth as academics. That's because that's all they know. In addition to this, they are way overtrained, and usually in one small, tiny, specialized area, and frequently at the expense of other basic social skills. Not only are their heads always in the books, but their family life, if they even have one, almost invariably suffers as a result. And as you might guess, the divorce rate in academia is widespread. It's huge, folks. And so what does this mean? It means that the higher echelons of academia ends up with this pileup of a lot of smart and intelligent experts who are many times unhappy and miserable. I hate to say that, but this is what I've seen myself personally. In my department alone, for example, which was a world-class department, the pressures to succeed in this miserable environment were so great that no less than 4 professors over the course of 15 years took their own lives. Many more had nervous breakdowns. Think about that. And everyone just swept it under the rug, nobody addressed it, and everyone continued onward as if nothing happened. Listen, bottom line, society gives these ivory tower experts way too much unmediated trust, and we rely on them for answers when many times these so-called experts haven't even figured out the answers to life's most basic questions themselves. Now, what does all this have to do with homeschooling? It actually has to do a lot with it, because you need to know that these are the very same experts who are forming public policy on education, policy that your child will eventually be required to follow. If you ask me, personally, I'd rather bypass all these so-called experts and instead opt for a parent who is fully grounded in solid principles and values, has good parental role models, has a decent level of everyday smarts, and a very good degree of common sense. And with just these attributes alone, folks, anyone can competently master and teach the subjects that are necessary to give your child a world-class education. I have no doubt of this. But many of you might not believe me. I know that. Or worse, you might not believe in your own ability to do this. Of course you don't, because you've been told all your life that only university-trained teachers who themselves were taught by ivory tower experts at the university are the only ones qualified to do such a job. And that's part of the problem, folks, of giving institutional-based specialists or university-based experts your unmediated trust. They'll keep you second-guessing or doubting your natural and innate ability to become the primary teacher of your own child. Folks, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Most of our country's founding leaders were either homeschooled or educated in one-room schoolhouses in rural counties. Think about that. Think about that. They didn't have a principal, a vice principal, school secretary, a reading specialist. They didn't have a school psychologist. They didn't have a custodian, a cafeteria staff, or instructional aides. Nor did they have school councils, a county office of education, or a multi-billion-dollar national budget. And think about this. If you look at the elementary school tests that were given at the turn of the 20th century, around 1910, you'll find math problems in that test that even an advanced placement student in high school today cannot do. Now, how is that even possible, you ask? I'll tell you how. Our curriculum has been progressively dumbed down by a never-ending stream of recommendations from each new generation of these so-called ivory tower experts. Now, the bottom line is this. In the past, we got far better results with much less. Today, however, we're getting dismal results even though we have much more. I'll say it one more time. You have to believe in your own innate ability, people, to be your child's primary teacher. It's been done before by millions of parents of the past, but our modern mindset today has clouded our ability to envision this. Our modern-day experts have convinced us somehow that such a job is only reserved for certain qualified specialists. And that's a crock. And I'll tell you why. Because all you need is a decent set of principles and values, good role models, a decent level of everyday smarts, and a good dose of common sense. That's all our nation's ancestors had, and they did an incredible job. That's because those ancestors of old were the original teachers. Those parents, those mothers and fathers of old were the original experts. And don't ever forget that. Don't ever lose that. Remember, it's never too late to reclaim that self-reliance self-reliant approach. It's never too late to restore your constitutionally guaranteed right to craft your own family's education plan and to become independent and competent problem solvers for yourselves and for your families. And finally, to become the true subject matter experts that you were always meant to be. Once again, thanks for listening and have a great day.